Hello students, welcome back to Recorded Lecture. So today we are going to talk about your final book of the semester, your final author of the semester, who is Max Weber. So this one is The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. So here is Karl Emil Maximilian Weber, an excellent German name. And he, much like the author that we read last week, was born in Prussia, but over the course of his lifetime, Prussia became the German Empire, and then it became the Weimar Republic, so he was alive during a lot of change, especially in his home country. So he was trained as a lawyer, but these days we think of him primarily as a sociologist, although he did do some work in economy, so some people claim him as an economist. So growing up, I lived in a house that was religiously divided, which will be important coming up. His father was not particularly religious, but his mother was a very strict Calvinist. So Calvinists are Protestants, but they believe that essentially everyone is predestined to go either to heaven or to hell, and there's nothing you can do about it. So you're supposed to live like a really good life so that people will know you're going to heaven, but there's really nothing to be done. Like, it's not up to you. So it's a very strict, sort of a dark version of Protestantism. So Weber himself, of course, got an excellent education, and he was trained in law. So he became a lawyer and a law professor as a young adult man, and he was pretty much planning to do that for the rest of his life, but he joined an academic society that was focused on immigration law. And then he started to notice that there were, essentially social differences between people who were born in a country and people who immigrated to a country. Again, very relevant. So he started thinking about social policy instead. So as a young man, he made an excellent decision, which was marrying a very cool woman, Mariana, who was a feminist, and she was like a journalist and an author, and she helped him with a lot of his writing. And this is not one of those things that people were open about at the time, but she was a very important part of his writing process. She did a lot of his editing. And after his death, she helped preserve his legacy because basically in the part of the world where they lived, in the 30s, there was a rising Nazi power, but the Nazis were extremely concerned about mental illness as like a sign of you being a bad person. So she had to destroy all of his journals where he talked about his depression. And she had to destroy all of his medical records, and she hid a bunch of stuff too. So he's pretty cool, pretty good feminist icon. So he was being a law professor, but in 1903 he decided to stop teaching and instead to focus on his writing. And he became, for 5 minutes, a politician because he thought that would be a good way to sort of help and do, things that would lead to social progress. But as soon as he became a politician, he was like, oh no. And he realized that the politicians themselves were so frustrating that he couldn't bear to stay there. So this is what he said. In 9 out of 10 cases, they are windbags puffed up with hot air about themselves. They are not in touch with reality, and they do not feel the burden they need to shoulder. They just intoxicate themselves with romantic sensations. And I love this quote. I just think it's so funny that for so many hundreds, really even thousands of years, we've been talking about politicians and how we don't trust them and how they're out of touch with reality. It's just funny to see, sort of another example of there being nothing new under the sun. So during this sort of period of exploration, if you will, he actually came all the way to America. He went to St. Louis for the World's Fair. So in those times, every year there'd be a World's Fair in a different city somewhere else in the world, and that year it was St. Louis's turn. So if you've ever seen the giant arch there, that was built for the World's Fair, and they had a lot of really interesting stuff that year. But I wanted to show you some examples of essentially what was the newest and shiniest and best stuff in technology. And basically people were excited about X-ray machines. They didn't know yet about the radiation being damaging, but they knew about X-rays. They had just discovered that you could put unhealthy infant babies into incubators as a way to try to prevent infant mortality and a way to keep them alive and healthy longer. But what they used to do was put the incubators behind a glass wall, and it was like an exhibit. You could just go up and observe the babies in the incubators as though they were in a zoo. But that wasn't all. They also would put, humans out there like they were exotic animals. So Geronimo was one of the humans who was on display that year. They also had just invented personal cars. And I think also fascinating, they had some electric streetcars already. So We've had the capability for electric cars for, again, 100 years. We just liked gasoline better. So the 1904 World's Fair, pretty interesting stuff. But ultimately, he came back to Germany, and he decided that he was going to devote the rest of his life to scholarly writing. So this was his first major piece, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. So this was published in 1905, and basically it's looking at a relationship between religion and economy. So his argument essentially is that we pick our jobs and we pick the way that we think about work itself based on our religion and not the other way around. So this was a brand new thought, and it contained a lot of sort of brand new science. So these days, we don't necessarily love the science, but it's still considered one of the like foundational works of sociology. This is one of the first pieces to use the stuff that we were talking about last week, that Durkheim said, about using social facts to measure social phenomenon. So just for some background before we get started, I wanted to talk about the difference between Protestantism and Catholicism. So within Christianity, there are several branches, but the two main branches are Catholicism and Protestantism. So Protestantism emerged pretty much in the 1600s with Martin Luther, who you've probably read about. And he was one of the people who said, I think that the Catholic Church is actually incredibly sketchy. I think it's weird that they have, a pope, and that you can't talk directly to God, and that we don't educate the peasants, and like essentially this whole thing where you pay for people to get out of hell. Like he thought all of that was very sketchy. So he broke from Catholicism and founded a new church, and that church he called Protestantism. And the fundamental principles are essentially all about an average person being able to access the religion. Because Catholicism was very careful to keep the practitioners and the clergy separate. Usually they did Mass in Latin, which was a language that nobody spoke. When they did Mass in English, they still didn't let anybody read the Bible. So one of the foundational things for Protestantism is called sola scriptura, and it's the idea that, yes, the Bible is the highest authority, like in the sense that there is no human who is above the Bible, but you have to read the Bible yourself. So essentially, you do not worship the priest or the pope, you worship the Bible itself. And this is essentially removing the middleman. So instead of, having to be told what God says, you read what God says. Everybody reads the Bible, and everybody believes what the Bible says. So that's a pretty important thing. Like, it's a very humanizing, I guess, way to think about religion. It's a sort of underdog way. They're also really into sola fide, which is the power of faith, basically, faith alone. That you don't get into heaven based on good work, and you don't get into heaven based on good deeds, and you certainly don't get into heaven because your family paid the priest. You get into heaven based solely on faith. So long as your faith is strong enough, you get to go to heaven. So most of the religions that you see practiced in America that aren't Catholicism are some variation on Protestantism. Like, it's gotten, extremely varied since then. But that's essentially the point. So within Catholicism, there's like a hierarchy, and within Protestantism, you should be able to talk directly to God. Okay, so I had you read this introduction because he goes over a couple of concepts that he doesn't go over later on. So I just wanted to get some of these kind of key concepts, especially about capitalism, out of the way. And most issues of this book do include this introduction. Like, it's kind of, generally associated. So, most of the introduction is about how people are doing capitalism wrong and whether that has anything to do with religion. So he talks a little bit about Occidental orientations and Oriental orientations. And this is kind of old school language. We don't necessarily say this anymore. But basically, the whole school of Western thought breaks the globe up into the East and the West, which is, of course, confusing since it's a sphere. But basically, the Eastern world is, Asia and everything that is contained within all of those multiple continents. And the Western world is Western Europe and North and South America. So you'll notice Africa left completely out of the story. So when he says things about what's going on in the Orient or what's going on in the Occident, that's what he's talking about. There's just sort of different words for East and West. Okay. So his main premise is going to sound very familiar to you. He is basically saying, I have looked around and I have noticed a bunch of social changes. Basically, the world around me is changing. And just like everybody else, what he was talking about was the Industrial Revolution. So He argues that in the West, we're seeing these changes that he thinks are going to have ultimately a universal impact. And he wasn't wrong about that. This idea of industrialization, especially factories and moving to cities, like that has been universally impactful, well, at least planetarily impactful. So he wasn't wrong about that. It's just that he was really dismissive of the things that were going on in what he called the East. Like he noticed that other cultures had developed art that he believed to have value and science that he believed to have value, but he still just kind of dismissed them as inferior. He's really only interested in the West. So one of the changes that Weber has noticed is a change in how we think about money, and specifically the ways that we sort of practice the exchange of money. So he is talking about capitalism, and his argument is we have become obsessed with capitalism, but we're doing it wrong. So what he says as an insult is pretty good. The impulse to acquisition, pursuit of gain, of money, of the greatest possible amount of money, has in itself nothing to do with capitalism. Unlimited greed for gain is not the least identical with capitalism, and still less its spirit. So he's saying this thing that you're doing, where you gather up as much money as possible and sit on it like a dragon, that's not capitalism. What is capitalism, you might ask? For him, it's like a rational process. So it's not the acquisition of wealth and the hoarding of wealth like Rousseau talked about. It's more of an active thing that you do. It's a way of sort of thinking about money. It's a way of thinking about exchange. So he says, we will define a capitalistic economic action as one which rests on the expectation of profit by the utilization of opportunities for exchange. That is on formally peaceful chances of profit. Okay, so there's two important things here. One, capitalism is always about exchanges with the expectation of profit. And two, capitalism is formal and it is peaceful. So again, on the one hand, it's meant to increase your earnings. Like it's definitely a thoughtful process. It's like an algorithm. Like you look down at what you're starting with and what you want to end with, and you think hard about it. But two, it's meant to be peaceful. It's meant to be something that happens in the marketplace. Like it's not supposed to be dodgy, and it's not supposed to be aggressive, and it's not supposed to be tricky. It's supposed to be like a formal, peaceful process. Like you sit down, you make an exchange, you go home. So part of doing this is maintaining balance. And here he's talking about a very literal balance, which is to say like your banking balance. But I think this is kind of an interesting way to think about it. So he says, everything is done in terms of balances. At the beginning of the enterprise, an initial balance. Before every individual decision, a calculation to discern its probably profitableness. And at the end, a final balance to ascertain how much profit has been made. So again, it's not like an aggressive free-for-all capitalism. It's a very like calm, measured capitalism. You start with how much money you have. You go through an interaction, you end with how much money you have. So it's like a thoughtful thing. So one distinction that Weber makes in regard to capitalism is the way that we think about labor. So again, this is pretty familiar over the course of the semester, but his argument is that having labor be a thing that you can pay for changes how we think about work. So we're not working for ourselves, we're not working for our own profit, we're working for someone else. And so essentially we have to organize all of the laborers together and give them a different task. So the way that he views this change is what he calls rational industrial organization. So it's no longer like, hey, call your cousin and maybe he'll help you. Now it's a series of strangers doing a series of interconnected jobs, but none of them need to communicate, none of them need to know each other, and every single penny needs to be counted. So he says that the rational aspect of this organization is brought about by two things. One, the separation of business from the household. So again, this is something that we've talked about, this idea of leaving the house to do work. When you're on a farm, you stay on the farm to do all your work. But if you live in a city, there's a separation between where you live and where you work, between what you do at home and what you do at your job. And this is a different thing. This is a brand new thing for this period in history. And the second is rational bookkeeping. So again, we've long paid people for labor, but this idea of how much you pay and how much they need to live, and like, whether you pay more for certain jobs, like all of that is kind of brand new. That's exactly what we've been talking about all semester. This idea that we have to think about for the first time wages and living wages and minimum wages. And so when he talks about rational bookkeeping, that's a lot of what he's talking about making decisions based on rational thinking rather than on feelings. So these are important changes. You've left the house to go to work, and when you get there, it's not going to be about your feelings. Another massive change is that we can think about labor rationally because of how much of it we need. So he says the particular modern Western form of capitalism has been, at first sight, strongly influenced by the development of technical possibilities. So the development of technical possibilities that he's talking about is essentially machinery, is factories. Before we had factories, we didn't need that many employees. Like, even if you could get together 2,000 people at the same time in the same place, like, what were they going to do? Like, all milk the cow? Like, that's not a thing. So the fact that we have factories now and we have machines has been the major game changer. So now we need a labor force. We didn't need free labor. And by the way, they're not free. That's just the term he uses. But essentially, we didn't need this kind of labor until we had the machines for them to work on. So the reason that we're thinking about labor differently is because of these technological advances. Alongside these technological advances were social changes. And a lot of these social changes occurred in order to protect the workers, but also, in a sense, to protect the factories. But what he's talking about here is essentially the means to punish people, the means to get justice in relation to the workplace. So he says, among those of undoubted importance are the rational structures of law and of administration. For modern rational capitalism has need not only of the technical means of production, but of a calculable legal system and of administration in terms of formal rules. So if we're going to get all these people together, it can't just be like the one old guy in the town making decisions anymore. It has to be a legal system. It has to be a rational system. It has to have formal rules. This is something we talked about a lot last semester, so this may sound kind of familiar. But basically, we need to organize our society. So he's saying, in the same way that the cities are rising up and the sort of workforce is rising up, so too does the law rise up and the administration rise up. So we need this sort of organization. We also need people who believe that we're making the right decision here. Because it might surprise you to learn, but during this period in history, there were a lot of people who thought that we were making a terrible mistake. A lot of people said that we shouldn't move to cities and we shouldn't continue industrialization. That essentially this social change was ripping us apart. So he argues that in addition to the means of being able to work and the organization of being able to work, you need people who believe that this is the right thing to do. For though the development of economic rationalism is partly dependent on rational technique and law, it is at the same time determined by the ability and disposition of men to adopt certain types of practical rational conduct. So this is like, if you've ever been like stuck in rush hour traffic, or even if you're just like on the way, to work or to class in the morning, and you have that moment where you're like, what am I doing? Like, why am I doing this? Like, who decided this was a thing that we do, this early in the morning or on rainy days? Like, this doesn't seem like a good idea. What he's talking about is the fact that you overcame that thought and you did it anyway. Like this ability of men to adopt. He's talking about this ability that humans have to be like, yeah, this is fine. Like, this is normal. Like, this is how we do work. Like this ability to sort of believe that you're doing the right thing instead of, burning the place down and going to live in the forest. So not only do we have work that needs to be done and an organization about how to do it, we also have to have people who are willing to do it and people who are willing to do this kind of work, to go into a factory and to get paid minimum wage. Like, we need men. So the major difference, he says, is that in previous societies, there wasn't necessarily any like duty to work hard. There wasn't any duty to accumulate wealth. That most of the time, religion has been very impactful, but religion has been very specifically not geared towards wealth. So he says the magical and religious forces and the ethical ideas of duty based upon them have in the past always been among the most important formative influences on conduct. So he's essentially setting the stage. He says, okay, social change is happening, work change is happening, payment change is happening. Is this somehow tied to religion? So that's going to be his major foundational question, because in previous generations, people had been told essentially to be poor by their religions. But in this generation, he's noticing that people are being rich and religious. So he's like, what is this? Okay, so now that we know what Protestantism is and what he felt like capitalism should be, we can get started. So in chapter 1, he begins with a sort of key observation. Business leaders and owners of capital, as well as higher grades of skilled labor, and even more the higher technically and commercially trained personnel of modern enterprises, are overwhelmingly Protestant. So this is like peak sociology. This is what we do. We sort of go out into the world and we notice something strange, and then we decide to apply some science to it. So basically, Weber is looking around and he's like, it seems to me that everybody at the top of the sort of corporate food chain is Protestant and everybody at the bottom is Catholic. And so essentially, he has noticed this link and he spends the rest of this reading that we're going to do trying to explain it. So he's going to go through a series of social factors just to sort of make sure that it's not those. So the first social factor that he notices is geography. And basically, this doesn't have anything to do with the land, it just has to do with who switched over to Protestantism when. So he says a number of those sections of the old empire, and he's talking about the Ottoman Empire, but also the Holy Roman Empire, which were most highly developed economically, went over to Protestantism in the 16th century. The results of that circumstance favor the Protestants even today in their struggle for economic existence. So here he's talking about, Martin Luther and the whole Protestant Revolution in the 16th century. And this is a map of essentially who was practicing what religion when Weber was writing. So the Catholics are in green, the yellow is Lutherans, the blue is Calvinists, and the pink, of course, is the Anglican Church of England. So Weber, if you remember, is up here sort of in what would be northern Germany today, and almost everybody there was Lutheran. So essentially, he's looking around at Western Europe and he's noticing that a lot of the industrial empire or industrial revolution is happening in like these specific places. Like it's beginning in northern Germany, in the Netherlands, and of course in England, and like France and Spain and Italy, like they're lagging way behind. So the first thing that he notices is that there is a geographical difference with who is doing what. The second thing that he notices is that the people who are on the top of the sort of corporate food chain tended to already have wealth before they started, their sort of progression up the chain. He says, participation in the above economic functions usually involves some previous ownership of capital and generally an expensive education, often both. So this should sound familiar. This is something that we've sort of been building up to all semester. He starts with what Rousseau was talking about ownership of capital, about that building of capital to build wealth. And then he acknowledges some social factors, the way that wealth can lead to a good education. And again, if you can get both, 100. So this just sounds sort of familiar in regard to the first paper as well, this idea that starting with wealth can lead to an education which can lead to more wealth. So he says, these are today largely dependent on the possession of inherited wealth, or at least on a certain degree of material well-being. So if you can start out with inherited wealth, amazing. If you can at least start out with inherited, being fine, that'll do. Once they have that wealth and they can afford some education, he notices that the Catholics and the Protestants tend to educate their children a little bit differently. So it's important to know here the way that Germany does their educational system. And it used to be a lot more strict. Like you used to have to really decide which direction you were going to go in. And today it's a little more fluid, but basically after middle school, you choose a track and it breaks down into 3 different categories. So there's gymnasium, which is preparing for the university. So that would be, I think, kind of like the modern IB programs. And then there's Hauptschule, where you prepare for a vocation. So in those, you would go into, electricians or plumbing or mechanics or something like that. And then there's real Schule, which is sort of a mix of both. And it's important to note here too that in Germany they don't have the sort of class or value added to whether you do university or vocation. Like in America, it's sort of seen as like a white collar, blue collar thing, but in Germany, there's no sort of social shame regarded with going into a vocation. It's a very respected sort of thing. That's why their cars work so well. So essentially, you choose when you're about like 11 if you want to go the vocational track or the university track, or sometimes you can be sort of in the middle. So what Durkheim noticed was that the Catholics were sending their children largely to the gymnasium. So they were doing what he calls a humanistic education, which is similar to what y'all are doing now. It's a very liberal arts, studying of the humanities. And so he thinks this might be one reason why. He says so few Catholics are engaged in capitalistic enterprise. He thinks that maybe it's because they went to school and they studied the humanities instead of going to school and studying a useful vocation. Like they didn't learn to be engineers, they didn't learn to be managers. They learned, to sit around and talk about philosophy like us. He also notices that once the Catholics and the Protestants get into their job, they behave a little bit differently. So he thinks that the Catholics tend to kind of stay put, like they learn their craft and then they just chill. The Catholics show a stronger propensity to remain in their crafts. And then he contrasts that with the Protestants. And he thinks that the Protestants are not content to remain with their craft and sort of do what they do. He says the Protestants want to climb that ladder. Whereas the Protestants are attracted to a larger extent into the factories in order to fill up the upper ranks of skilled labor and administrative positions. So once they get into their jobs, he thinks that the Protestants have a little bit more, sort of gumption, like to rise up the ladder, whereas the Catholics are content. The final explanation that he examines is family. So this one is very complicated because here he's talking about not just sort of learning a profession through your father, although that's a very common thing. He's also talking about what your family might push you into doing, what your family's, community, your family's religion, your family's traditions, like how those sorts of things might influence your job choice. So he says, the explanation of these cases is undoubtedly the mental and spiritual peculiarities acquired from the environment. Here, the type of education favored by the religious atmosphere of the home community and the parental home have determined the choice of occupation, and through it, the professional career. So essentially, the peculiarities acquired from your environment, which today we would call social factors, um, influence what you believe that you can do and what you choose to do. So again, this should sound very familiar based on your first paper. So he feels like none of those are necessarily a strong enough explanation. So he thinks now it might be time to look to religion. So he says, thus the principal explanation of this difference must be sought in the permanent intrinsic character of their religious beliefs, and not only in their temporary external historico-political situations. So he thinks like, yeah, all of those social factors are real, but they are not the determining factor. He thinks it must be the way that they practice their religion. So he says, it will be our task to investigate these religions with a view to finding out what peculiarities they have or have had, which might have resulted in the behavior we have described. So this is sort of his mission statement. He's like, what we're going to do is we're going to poke our face into this religion. We're going to kind of root around and see what's different with the Catholicism and with Protestantism, and see if those differences could explain the difference in behavior. Before he really digs into that, he gets a little bit weird, so I'll go over this kind of briefly. But he says there is an option that he considered but dismissed, which is the idea that Catholics are just more like ascetic. He says, on a superficial analysis and on the basis of certain current impressions, one might be tempted to express the difference by saying that the greater otherworldliness of Catholicism, the ascetic character of its highest ideals, must have brought up its adherents to a greater indifference to the good things of the world. So he's saying maybe the Catholics are just so content with their lot in life, they just feel it is their place to suffer, like they are really just waiting for heaven. So maybe that explains why they're so chill about their jobs and they don't try to make more money. Maybe they're just sort of waiting out their time on earth. But then he's like, no, I don't, no, no. And he basically names a whole series of Catholics he know that do hustle to make more money, or who live, quote, otherworldly existences, or rather who don't live otherworldly existences, but who tend to live for the worldly part, you know? So he's basically like, yeah, I've seen the Pope drink beer. There's no way that he doesn't enjoy earthly pleasures. And then he names a few more examples, which, like, okay, thank you, favor. But basically, what he's trying to say is it could be that they're listening to the part about the Bible that says, like, rejoice in your poorness, you know, like you can't take your wealth to heaven. But he's like, nah, it's more likely to be that it's something else. So here he sort of, as clearly as possible, lays out his goal for the rest of this book. If any interrelationship between certain expressions of the old Protestant spirit and the modern capitalistic culture is to be found, we must attempt to find it, for better or worse, not in its alleged more or less materialistic, or at least anti-ascetic joy of living, but in its purely religious characteristics. So basically, he's like, listen, if there's a connection, we're going to find it. We're going to throw some science at this, and we're going to see what happens. All right, so that was the end of the reading that you had to do, but I wanted to show you some sort of modern correlations to see if he might be right about this. And this is really interesting stuff, I think. This is several different ways to examine the relationship between wealth and religion. And of course, it's not direct, but let's look. So, the first thing to acknowledge, of course, is that Americans are less religious than ever. In Well, this graph only goes back to 1994, but you'll notice in 94 it was still like, close to 70%. If you go back even further than that, we get to a point where at least 90% of Americans said that they were religious and almost all of them Christian. But these days it's getting lower and lower. So in this one, you can see that by 2014 it had dropped to about 60%. And in the year since then, it has dropped more, but I couldn't find another graph quite this beautiful. So number one, fewer Americans are religious to begin with. Number two, among the like drop in religion, the drop in Protestantism has been the strongest, and Catholicism the second strongest. So the amount of people who identify as religious going down. Once you break it into specific religions, you can see which religions are moving faster than the others. So Protestantism, I mean, it's not a dramatic drop. We're going from 51 to 43. Catholicism from about 24 to 20. What's interesting here is that you can see a corresponding rise in non-religion. So this gray one, this is people who answered nothing in particular, like they are, spiritual, but not necessarily religious. So there it rose from 12 to 17%. The agnostics are on the rise, only 2%, and the atheists also on the rise, but only 2%. So the adherence to Protestantism and Catholicism has dropped in recent years, so we can't make a super direct correlation to Weber's work, but we can still do it a little bit. So this data is from the 2000 census, and you've probably gotten in the mail some information about the 2020 census. Please do it. We love this data. I couldn't find data from the 2010 census to show you, but generally speaking, there's not a lot of movement in this. Median annual household income and religion tend to co-vary pretty steadily. So if you look at this one, you'll notice that there is a dramatic difference in the sort of median income among Americans in regard to what religion they practice. So at the very bottom, the Jews, they tend to make the most money. And then we start to sort of range into different variations on Christianity. There's a few over here that aren't Christian. We got our Buddhists here, they're at about 40,000, and our Muslims at about 30,000. But most of the rest of these, oh wait, sorry, we got Hindus down here. Most of the rest of these are just different sects of Christianity. So I wanted to show you this because even with the Protestants and the Catholics here, you can see, a differentiation. So the Catholics, I lost them. Here they are. The Catholics are pretty middle of the road. They're looking at about 47,000. And all of the rest of these are Protestant, so it's a little bit hard to measure. But even when you break down Protestantism, there does tend to be a vast divide. So you'll notice that the Unitarians are doing pretty great. They tend to believe just sort of like general Christianity. They're pretty inclusive. And the Episcopalians, and then some of the evangelicals. And if you look down at the very bottom, you'll see some of the more conservative sects of Christianity, Jehovah's Witnesses and Seventh-day Adventist and Pentecostal. They tend to have the lowest average incomes. And we'll see in a minute some other factors that might explain that. So this is the same sort of data, but this one is from 2014. So, or sorry, this was the 2010 census, but it was published in 2014. So here you can see what percentage of the religious group makes what amount of money. So this sort of helps to explain like a better picture of how much money people are making. So if we start at the top, we'll see that nearly half of Jewish practitioners are making more than $100,000, which is substantial. And if we look oppositely at the bottom, we see that about half of Jehovah's Witnesses, National Baptist, and Church of Christ are making less than 50,000. So you can see that there really is a substantial difference here. Again, if we're just measuring Catholic versus Protestant, it's a little bit hard. The Catholics tend to be relatively evenly divided, although a third of them are in the bottom bracket, and almost all of the rest of these are Protestant. But it's still kind of an interesting graph, I think, if you think about what you've noticed in your life about the people that you know and how much wealth they think that they have and what religion that they practice. You can see that there are some correlations here. Okay, this one's complicated, but very beautiful, I think. So in this one, on the vertical axis, we're looking at percentage of American households with an annual income above 75,000. So we're already looking at a pretty good amount of accumulated wealth. So this is people who are already in like basically the top quintile of wealth. Oh no. And then on the horizontal axis, we're looking at college graduates. So if you combine these two pieces of data, what you find is that people who have a college education are more likely to have wealth. So the more likely it is that you graduated from college, the more likely it is that you have substantial wealth. So we see that the Hindus and the reformist Jews, conservative Jews here at the top, they are not only the most likely to have a college education, they are the most likely to be making a significant amount of money. And again, we see the same sort of repetition of the information that we saw before. The Jehovah's Witnesses and the Pentecostals tend to be at the bottom of the income earning spectrum, but they are also at the bottom of the educational spectrum. So there does tend to be a covariance between wealth and education. And then if we add this third variable, there is a covariance between wealth, education, and religious practice. And this is not just an American thing. If you look here, this is basically measuring how poor a country tends to be on the on the horizontal axis here, and then how religious they tend to be on the vertical axis here. And as you can see, the countries that are poorer tend to be more religious. And there's a direct correlation. So this is what we call a scatter plot. It sort of looks like a, Dalmatian or something. And what you're looking for is a sort of cluster. So you're trying to draw lines that hit as many of the dots as possible, or at least come as close to many of the dots as possible, and that tells you what you're looking at. So in this one, we see a relatively steady downward curve, which means that there's a direct, traceable correlation between religiosity, like the percent who say that religion is important in their lives, and income. What's interesting here is that as people get more wealthy, they get less religious, except for America. Here we are, way off in the middle over here. Just a major outlier, and we'll see why in a second. Okay, so we're going to keep layering our data. In this map, it's broken down by counties, and we're looking at two overlapping pieces of information, what race people are and what religion they practice. So in this county, we're looking at the most common both race and religious practice. So what you'll see is that it does vary depending on geography. So in orange, we're looking at African American Protestants, and in pink, we're looking at Hispanic Catholics. And I want you to pay attention to those two because that's going to become relevant here in the next map. But it's also just sort of interesting to see what religion people practice in what part of the country. It won't shock you to learn that these are the Mormons. Um, most of the sort of, quote, Bible Belt is white evangelical Protestants or white mainline Protestants. We see a lot of white mainline Protestants up here too. That's where all the German Lutherans landed. And we see a few Hispanic Protestants represented here. That's not as common as Hispanic Catholics, which I think is interesting. So this is what race people are and what religion they practice. This is the poverty broken down by county. So basically in this one, the darker the color, the more people who are in poverty in that county. So basically it starts with just about 3% who are in poverty. Those are the counties that are in white, and it ranges all the way down to purple, where up to 50% of that county is in poverty. So that's the only thing we're looking at here. But if we flip back and forth between them, you'll notice some correlations. So this is, like, let's focus on the purple southeast. This is who's impoverished there. You'll notice this is where we tend to find African American Protestants. If you look at the southwest coast now, this is who tends to be impoverished. This is who happens to be Hispanic. So there's a definitive race correlation here, even though that's not what these two graphs are measuring, if that makes sense. You should be able to see a very specific correlation between them. The last thing that I want you to notice is this. This patch of poverty right here is Native American Catholics. So this is where we tend to see reservations. So the poverty is very specifically related to race, even though that's not necessarily what they thought that they were measuring. Okay, so this one is broken down into counties again. You know how I like my data like this. This one is measuring religious adherence. So that means out of all of the residents, how many of them described themselves as religious. And then it doesn't matter which religion in this map, it's just how many of them are religious. And in this one, it ranges from less than a third of the people in the white counties on down to more than 75% of them in the dark counties. And again, one of the things that we're going to notice is that the poorer places tend to be more religious. So if you look at the dark red here, that tends to also see some overlap with the dark purple here. Dark red, dark purple, dark red, dark purple. And then if we think about the places that are up like 50% up to 75% or 35% up to 50%, so we're looking at least a third up to 2/3 of people are religious, we'll notice that that correlation again exists between religiosity and poverty. Religiosity, poverty. So I think that's, again, a representation of data they weren't trying to measure, but they sort of accidentally measured. And finally, this is another way of thinking about how important people are. So this is, again, measuring religiosity. And this one is bigger, it's like less specific in the data, but we see the same thing sort of happening. So in the southeastern states, we see that they are, the most religious. Like that's where the people mark religion as the most important to them. And then if we look at the northeast and the northwest corners of America, we see that those are the least religious. And if we measure this data against the poverty data, sorry for skipping around again, you'll see that the northwestern and northeastern countries are also the least impoverished. So what we have here is a direct connection between religion, wealth, education, race, and geography. America. All right, tune in next week and we will talk about what he finds when he starts to dig into this relationship between Protestantism and Catholicism.